noticed by now we are running behind schedule a little bit, so calm down. But it's more to tell the people that are online that you are in the right venue. You haven't gotten lost or anything. So don't leave us. We'll start in a few minutes' time, or so I've been informed. Okay, so chill, relax. We could do some ice-breaking, dancing, and introductions and things, but otherwise just get to know each other. Okay, thank you. Hold on.
This book that comes here, I don't know what to do. So we carried over. We used to carry the Kyokushin.
Ladies and gentlemen, this thing is working. Gloria, is this thing working? Is it working? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, my brother and friend, Professor Mpedi. You're not my friend last year. We are friends now. And our guests of honor and a tribune of our people. You know, tribune of the masses, champion of our people, hero of our people, Tembeka, Ngcukaitobi. You know, who best, you know, with a dazzling wattage. About 8 years ago, at least speaking for myself, that's when I first encountered him. He was litigating against Zuma, you know, the criminality of the Zuma administration. That's when we first met him. And, you know, a meteor, you know, it streaks across the sky, and then it disappears. This brother here hasn't disappeared. He's still in our midst. And this republic still reposes its trust in him. When the times are hard, we say, we summon Tembeka. Tumelu Tembeka. It is my distinct pleasure to meet you, brother. I'm seeing you for the first time, you know. And I salute, you know, the MISTRA executives that are here, the board members of MISTRA, distinguished guests, brothers and sisters. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the MISTRA annual lecture, a lecture that has become a fixture of excellence in our ideational calendar. You know, last year we had Professor Marwala, who used to be the chieftain of this place. And the year before, we had some Chinese scholar. You know, I forgot his name, Joel. Whatever. All I remember, he said something that will never escape me. He says the economy is power, you know. The economy is power. You know, when China had been ravaged to smithereens by the Cultural Revolution, what did China do? It caused it up to the West, you know, and built its economy. You know what Deng Xiaoping characterized as hide your strength and bide your time. And today, China, almost 30 years later, the second biggest economic power in the world. It can project its geopolitical power against anyone. You know, and it does so because it's got this strong economy, where it's got a strong culture, you know, hegemonic culture and all of that. So I think, you know, it should be our aspiration that in the fullness of time, Joel, we should be in that position as well, where we have such a strong economy that we can thumb our nose at everyone, as we did in Gaza. With Tembeka and Ngcukaitobi. I will introduce him later, I mean, in total, you know, but for now, I want to invite Professor Mbedi, the Vice Chancellor of this university, to open up for us. Thank you, sir.
Program Director, Oyama Mavandla, Chairperson of MISTRA, Council of Advisors. You know, I have to pause there. We have got something special in common, me and him, you know. At different times, we practice the same style of karate, the true karate, Kyokushin Kaikan, Oyama karate. So it's good to have you here, to be in your presence. You know, yeah, we can go on and on about it. Let me recognize the executives and members of the board of MISTRA, our friends. This lecture belongs here, you know, so every year around this time, just make sure you don't forget the way to UJ, because MISTRA and UJ are like this, you know. We'll change the speakers, but we'll partner forever and ever. I thought you'll say amen. And let me also acknowledge our guest speaker this evening, also a true friend of UJ, Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, Senior Counsel. You know, while we're waiting, I said he can't be lost, you know. He's a regular here. Yes, he's a regular and really a hero of the people. From time to time, when I see him doing amazing things, I'm a lawyer myself, and I send him WhatsApp that even today, I'm sure he doesn't know how to respond because you just sent a sign. I don't know how to interpret it. I say, Pagam and Ngcukaitobi, and then he just sent something so that I know, you know, I received the message. Last year, really, it was exciting with Prof. Marwala. When the Chinese guy was here, sorry to call him that I was not here, that, you know, I'm so excited. Not that Prof. Marwala is not important. You know, I'm a lawyer by training. And if no lawyers frequent this establishment, people will think this guy, you know, is not known and respected. And today you've brought Advocate Ngcukaitobi SC. You made my day, you made my evening, you made my year. So welcome, dear brother. The executives of the great University of Johannesburg, you know, we've got our Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic, Deputy Vice Chancellor Research, our Chief Operating Officer, and others have joined online. We've got the Executive Leadership Group. I saw Professor Kathleen van der Linde, Executive Dean, Acting Faculty of Law, and I saw a number of colleagues, Prof. Vicky, also them, you know, all the colleagues from UJ, students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I also want to acknowledge those that have joined us online. I should not make this mistake of forgetting people. I mean, things are advanced now. If you can't come in person, you can enjoy, follow everything. But unfortunately, those that have joined us will miss out the last item where there will be something to irrigate our tonsils after enjoying this lecture by Advocate Ngcukaitobi. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Letlhokampedi. I'm the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the great University of Johannesburg. It is indeed a great honor to welcome you to this year's Mapungubwe lecture. This year holds particular significance, ladies and gentlemen. We are 30 years into democracy. In the last few months, we have reflected a great deal on the monumental milestone. Indeed, there is a lot to celebrate. We have made great progress in many regards. We boast one of the most comprehensive and impressive constitutions in the world. But does this translate tangibly for our people? That is the question that I hope will be answered this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm thrilled to welcome our keynote speaker, Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, SC, this evening to provide some insight on the theme of critiques of constitutionalism 30 years on. The concept, ladies and gentlemen, of constitutionalism has been a cornerstone of modern democracies and has shaped our legal and social landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, constitutions serve as critical frameworks for safeguarding human rights, ensuring checks and balances, providing accountability, and of course, promoting the rule of law. Across the world, ladies and gentlemen, democracies have faced challenges from the rise of populism and authoritarianism to increasing demands for social justice and equality. The principles of constitutionalism are being tested like never before, and understanding these critiques allow us to reflect on how legal systems can adapt and evolve to meet the needs of contemporary society. Ladies and gentlemen, as we mark the 30 years of constitutionalism in South Africa, it is imperative to critically evaluate its impact in light of this broader societal shifts. The preamble of our Constitution begins with, "We the people." But has this really translated? And is the criticism leveled against constitutionalism in South Africa valid? Is the question that we hope will answer this evening. As the advocate argued earlier this year, to effectively counter populist attacks on the Constitution, we must engage in thorough research and analysis, addressing criticisms that it impedes socio-economic transformation. It's a Eurocentric imposition and unjustifiably limits democratic power. Ladies and gentlemen, Advocate Ngcukaitobi is well poised to lead this discussion on constitutionalism this evening. He is an advocate of the High Court of South Africa, as we all know, with degrees from UNITRA, Rhodes, and the London School of Economics. He's a member of the Judicial Service Commission and the Competition Tribunal, has been an advocate of the Johannesburg Bar since 2010, gained silk status in 2020, and has acted as a judge in various courts. Ladies and gentlemen, his advocacy covers competition, labor, and land law, notably serving as counsel for the Zondo Commission and arguing recently at the ICJ. He has written 2 academic books on land law and reform in South Africa, The Land is Ours and Land Matters. As his impressive credentials demonstrate, his intricate knowledge of the Constitution will undoubtedly provide us with a comprehensive and rich understanding of the nuanced debate around constitutionalism. I have no doubt, ladies and gentlemen, that this will be a compelling lecture that provides answers to many of our pressing questions. As the advocate has long stated, the Constitution is the only constant. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the great University of Johannesburg. I hope you'll enjoy this evening with us. Thank you, Program Director. Thanks, colleagues.
Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, I also want to salute those who are joining us online. I did not acknowledge them. Professor Mbedi has already introduced, So I will not bore you with that. In fact, I'd hoped that Joel and I could actually sing a song that we used to sing a long time ago. Joel, you remember the song? Zebra tumelu tabingwa. Do you know that song? You're Joel. Zebra tumelu tabingwa. Tumelu tabingwa. Tabingwa chelu ngom. Ngoma chelu Smith utizwe saltata. Tumelu tabingwa ya. So this song actually, when I was assigned this august role of introducing Advocate Ngcukaitobi and to be your program director tonight, this song just impaled my consciousness. It just came from somewhere, and I said, I'm going to sing this song, even though I'm vocally wounded. And I had hoped Joel would join me in it, because Joel knows where this song is from. By the way, Tembeka, my young brother, this song is what catalyzed the Toy Toy. The Toy Toy, its genesis, its locus, comes from this song. So when they would sing this song, then they would do other things. I'm not going to do them today. That belongs to Peter Mkaba, not at an august institution like this. However, without much ado, I'm going to say, Tumelu Tembeka, Tumelu Tembeka, Tumelu Tembeka.
Well, my problem is not just being vocally challenged, but it is also a problem of language. I would probably sing in Xhosa, but not in Shona.
Not in Ndebele.
Oh, it's Ndebele, so that's even worse, just shows my limitations. So thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you, Professor Mpedi. Professor George Mpedi, Letlhokwa Mpedi. Yes. Okay, Letlhokwa George Mpedi. All right. Yeah. Okay. And I have known each other for, I don't know now, for more than 10 years. Yeah. When I think he used to be Dean of Law.
That's right.
Yeah, so. And he used to write in social welfare. Prolific scholar there, so we've been friends since. And I'm also pleased that I've been asked by the Mapungubwe Institute. I've always looked at this institute with a lot of admiration in relation to the role that it played at its foundation and the role that it continues to play, this role of sort of critical analysis of the problems of the day and how to approach them. So I'm pleased that my hosts are both the University of Johannesburg. I think I'm still an adjunct professor here. I mean, I was given this letter that says you are an adjunct professor, but then it lapses after 3 years, and that was 4 years ago. So I don't know what's going on now. So this evening's exchanges is something I look forward to. Tonight's lecture is entitled Constitutionalism and its Malcontents. I propose to defend the Constitution despite its critiques and imperfections. And in doing so, I shall address 4 themes: history, inequality, representation, and the place of the judiciary. Constitutionalism is a unique idea, more so in a democracy. In its raw form, the Athenian-inspired impulse of democracy says that the people are both the government and the governed at the same time. As desirable as this idea, it is only an ideal, never in fact the lived reality of many. When the British introduced the limitations to the powers of the king through that veritable instrument, the Magna Carta of the 19th century, they did not in fact transfer political power to the people, but to a new class of parliamentarians. Later revolutions in France and in the United States of America also promised to append monarchical power, transferring power once and for all to the people. An area of contestation, however, remained. What is the place of legal authority? It was to this question that Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of the American Constitution, addressed in Federalist Paper 78. The judicial branch, he argued, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution. That is because judges have neither the force nor will, but merely judgment, and must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive for the efficacy of their judgments. A few decades later, the American democracy was the subject of a study by a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, in a book entitled Democracy in America, published in 2 volumes between 1835 and 1840. De Tocqueville was impressed by the individual freedoms granted by the American Bill of Rights to all men, which protected the individual from what he called the tyranny of the majority. Yet, de Tocqueville was not naive to who was excluded in the American conception of democracy: Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and of course, women. Of concern to him was that the Constitution protects the people from democracy. The separation of the judicial function from the political function has always been central to the creation of the modern democratic state. It is now part of a larger conception of the state, manifested as decentralization of authority. In the era of colonialism in Africa, a new dimension to the struggle against European conquest, mass murder, and despotic government was the struggle for the Bill of Rights to guarantee human liberty. And the question which once confronted the Americans about deciding how to protect human liberty loomed large also in Africa. A broader and a grander idea emerged: constitutionalism. Africans who first conceived of the installation of a constitutional state did so with their own experiences of colonial disruption and the possibility of its fundamental reversal. So, building constitutionalism required building democracy. And in a sense, this is a contradiction in terms. Democracy, in its unrestrained form, presents itself as a manifestation of people's power. But constitutionalism limits people's power. Unlike the model developed in Athens, modern post-colonial democracy has to be built by the people. An executive function is indispensable, and the creation of an independent judiciary as a final check on the exercise of political authority under the rule of law is necessary. So both the view and the vision of constitutionalism have remained contested throughout history. More fraught has been the ideal of an apex judiciary exercising judicial review powers over elected branches of government. Opponents of constitutionalism usually argue that without a people's mandate, quote unquote, judges might have authority but no legitimacy. The elected leaders, they say, should make the decisions with no interference from the unelected judges. Yet early 20th century lawyers, Alfred Mangena, Pixley Isaac Aseme, Richard Msimang, the list goes on, would have pointed to the impoverished nature of the argument. To safeguard rights, they would have argued one needs a judicial branch that is separate from the government. Today, we no longer have direct representation as it could have been originally conceived under the umbrella of democracy. A much smaller group of people run the affairs of state. In this country, only 400 of them. Ostensibly, on behalf of the multitudes, on behalf of the 63 million. While the justification for this phenomenon is usually functional, there are just too many people for direct democracy to work. It is worth looking at the other contestation between the people and their representatives. In his study, The Principles of Representative Government, Professor Bernard Manning has referred to the struggle by the elites of Europe for republicanism against democracy. The total absence in today's democratic systems, for instance, of the assembly system or the lot system, points to the elitism of the democratic system. I mean, here we have it by the spade, the elitism. Only 4,000 people elect one group, and then even there, then they select others. You go there, and then others, you just don't know, everybody just goes there, you know. In international terms, South Africa was among the last to achieve freedom, and with it, constitutionally guaranteed rights. But it is among the leading lights in showing the world what these rights and freedoms mean. It has shown that freedom is for all, not some. The rule of law is not only domestic, but global. And accountability matters regardless of race or religion. Deepening rights contained in constitutions rather than eroding them is intrinsically connected to the function of promoting democracy. Our democracy is enriched, not undermined by the rule of law and constitutionalism. At the heart of the rule of law and constitutionalism is the judicial function. When our judges interpret the law in a democracy, they are performing a legitimate function. But that legitimacy is not to be taken for granted. So this is why tonight I have decided to speak about the malcontents of constitutionalism. First, on definitions. By constitutionalism, I refer generally to a written text, not always, but generally, which establishes a system of government based on universal franchise and characterized by the supremacy of the Constitution, enforced by an independent judiciary, underpinned by the rule of law and social equality. To speak meaningfully about constitutionalism in South Africa, the history of the idea is necessary. I do this because it has become common these days to hear of the notion that the Constitution is an imposition from outside. We once lauded this Constitution for its promise, but we have betrayed it in the last 30 years. In its preamble, the Constitution recognized the injustices of the past, and it undertook to correct them. What are these injustices? Where does the Constitution come from? What are its founding influences? Why should we stand by it, even as the political class seeks to destroy it? I believe that the reason lies in the history of the idea of the Constitution itself. An enduring feature of the dream of the founders of the African National Congress, sorry to say, but it was them, was to end racial inequality. This had to be achieved through the Bill of Rights. Hence, in 1923, the ANC adopted the first Bill of Rights for South Africa. Ironically, this document incorporated the vision of equality espoused by the colonialist Cecil John Rhodes under the slogan, "Equality of rights for every civilized man south of the Zambezi." The adoption by the ANC of the 1923 Bill of Rights was a profound moment. Some 5 years earlier, in 1918, under the guidance of one of its most able sons, Richard Msimang, the ANC had adopted its own constitution. As testament to his commitment to constitutional government, by the late 1930s, Msimang would be described as a real constitutionalist, quote unquote. The constitution of the ANC, adopted in 1918, was a model for a future South Africa. It borrowed the Westminster style of government, comprising the executive and the parliament, which included a Senate, drawn from chiefs and traditional leaders. The ideas of a constitution and equality remained part of the folklore of the ANC for much of its early 20th century thinking. Aggressive Afrikaner nationalism had become the order of the day from the 1920s. And what this meant was a hegemony of white views as the Afrikaners sought to impose their language and culture and promote their economic position. Africans were not forgotten as such, but they were not treated as autonomous political actors, but subjects of political control and economic exploitation. There was also consolidation of capitalism. But there was also an emerging black professional strata of teachers, doctors, lawyers, journalists, and businessmen. The dream that inspired the founding of the ANC lived on, even as the ANC organizationally faltered to near extinction during the disastrous presidency of Pixlika Izakasem between 1930 and 1937, as noted by Dr. Ngculunga in his book, The Man Who Founded the ANC. I thought he was coming here. The Second World War of 1939, taking place primarily in Europe, gave a fresh, although deceptive, impetus to the possibility of African freedom. The Atlantic Charter of 1941, drawn between the British and the Americans as a vision of the post-World War European society, gave Africans a temporary hope that freedom was coming. The main idea of the Atlantic Charter was self-determination. Sir Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was a key proponent of the Atlantic Charter. He was keen to extend its reach to all European societies liberated from Nazi rule. But here at home in South Africa, one of the most thoughtful men of the time was Dr. Alfred Bitini Xuma. And he sought to theorize how the principles of the Atlantic Charter could apply to a situation of the oppressed African people of South Africa. Xuma's vision led to the preparation of the African Claims document, in which a statement of the Bill of Rights for Africans was contained. Although much more expansive than any document that had been produced by the ANC before, the Africans' claims continued the tradition of commitment to constitutional government, the Bill of Rights, and the principle of equality, which were foundational to the ANC from 1912. The African Claims document was produced in 1943 as a vision for a future South Africa. Voting would be extended to all adults. There would be a right to vote and to be elected in parliament, provincial councils, and other representative institutions for all. The courts would dispense equal justice to all. There would be freedom of movement and residence. Restrictive laws, such as the Natives Land Act, would be scrapped. There would be the right to freedom of the press. There would be sanctity and inviolability of the home and every family. Everyone could own, buy, hire, lease, and occupy land without any restrictions. There would be a right to engage in any occupation, trade, or profession without discrimination. Employment in the public service would be open to all. Every child would have the right to a free and compulsory education. Every child would be entitled to admission to technical schools, universities, and other institutions of higher learning. There would be equal pay for equal work and equal opportunity. Unfair policies and practices in employment would be abolished. I've decided to set this out expansively in order to draw the comparison between the vision of 1943 and the Constitution of 1994. Yet, by 1948, there was a counter-hegemonic force. The National Party was elected into power. D.F. Malan was explicit in articulating the idea of apartheid as the foundational policy of the state. Tonight, however, is not the night to speak about the National Party. At the December 1949 conference, the ANC adopted a program to confront the whites-only government head-on. This was an outcome of an internal agitation by the newly established ANC Youth League, which had become impatient with what they referred to as telegrams, deputations, and delegations. In fact, in that conference, Dr. James Moroka, with the support of the Youth League, roundly defeated Dr. Alfred Bitini Xuma, probably the best president the ANC ever had. Sorry, Joe. The program of action promised something more direct, the desire to achieve national freedom. By that, they meant the attainment of political independence. This would mean the end of segregation, apartheid, trusteeship, or white leadership. The demand was for direct representation, and the demand was to end all racial segregation. Neither the 1943 Africans' claims nor the 1949 program of action have been as popular as the Freedom Charter of 1955. Yet the Charter's spirit lies in the Africans' claims. The most important declaration of the Freedom Charter is that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people. This was the proposal of the African Bill of Rights, flowing from the 1923 Bill of Rights, itself a founding idea of the ANC. And the Freedom Charter has weathered many political storms. The idea of the Charter, contrary to popular belief, was first mooted at the 1953 conference of the ANC held in Queenstown by Professor Z.K. Matthews, who was a lecturer and principal at the University College of Fort Hare. You see, not everything comes from white people. By the end of that conference, a formal resolution was passed to create a Congress of the People, to draw up inter alia a Freedom Charter or Constitution embodying a vision of the future South Africa, as we in Congress see it. Professor Matthews did not attend the Congress of the People in Kliptown in June 1955, because the students at Fort Hare, where he was a principal, were on strike at that time. He was one of the accused of the treason trial in 1956, becoming an articulate spokesperson and presenting a strong defense of the Freedom Charter, where he denied that the Charter is a communist document. The communists did not form the Charter, it was formed by the Africans. For Matthews, the Charter was an extension of the Africans' claims. Its role was to refine the Africans' claims and to explain the conditions of government in a free, united, and democratic South Africa. As to its content, the Charter repeated many of the statements of rights contained in the Africans' claims. Unlike the Africans' claims, which placed emphasis on individual liberties, the Charter's prime occupation was the economic sphere, proclaiming that the national wealth of our country, the heritage of all South Africans, shall be restored to the people. The mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. Industry and trade would be controlled to assist the well-being of the people. The land would be redivided amongst those who work it. There would be work and security. Men and women of all races would receive equal pay for equal work. The Charter promised houses, security, and comfort, and to use unused housing space for homeless people. It would provide free medical care and hospitalization to all people, with special care for mothers and young children. Slums would be demolished and new suburbs with transport, roads, lighting, playing fields, creches, and social centers built. Orphans, the aged, the disabled, and the sick would be cared for by the state. A combination of the social and economic aims of the Charter and the individual liberties of the Africans' claims would form the bedrock of the late 20th century liberation rhetoric of the ANC. By the early 1990s, the collapse of the whites-only regime had become inevitable, although they will say they did us a favor by exiting the space. But the fact that the government was collapsing on its own, they forget conveniently. But what would replace it was still contentious. For its part, the ANC returned to its roots and rekindled the spirit of the Constitution, the spirit of the Bill of Rights, the spirit of universal franchise, a government based on the will of the people and a commitment to social and economic justice. These ideas would then be the epicenter of the new constitutional vision. But more still had to be done. The political power of the majority would be constrained by the power of the law. A new idea of constitutional supremacy entered the lexicon of the ANC. This was not hard to embrace, even as communist dogma had some influence in some of the policies of the time. Experiences of unrestrained despotic white power under apartheid were still fresh in the imagination of the men of the movement. Although the judges were unelected, they were seen as an essential check on the power of elected government. I can ask now the first of the questions which I intended to ask in this lecture. One of the most important ideas in the Constitution is equality. In simple terms, the Constitution intends to end inequality. Inequality in turn manifests in different forms, including race, gender, economic, social, and cultural. Racism and inequality are therefore inextricably bound. In 2018, the World Bank noted that South Africa is the most unequal society in the world, with 76% of the population living in poverty. 30% of the population is chronically poor. An overwhelming number of those classified as non-poor face the risk of slipping into the chronically poor category. Race, gender, and income disparity explain the depth of South Africa's inequality. Africans are at the highest risk of being poor. Children, large families, and people living in rural areas are especially vulnerable to remaining impoverished for lengthy periods. Poverty is also gendered, concluded the World Bank. The incidence of poverty is higher, or perhaps highest, for African women. Most municipalities in the 20 poorest local municipalities are in the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and KwaZulu-Natal. So poverty also has a geographic location. Of these, the 10 poorest municipalities are in the former homelands, thus highlighting the enduring legacy of apartheid. We have become accustomed to the notion that education will end poverty. That's certainly what my mother believed. This was the idea behind universalizing access to education, which has meant that an incredible number of black children have access to both secondary and university education. The hope is that education will take us out of poverty. But the World Bank has shown that while education can contribute to poverty reduction, it is asset distribution that is a stronger indicator of who is poor and who is not. This is what they said. For the poor, the financial assets represent 36% of total assets, while among the rich, financial assets represent 75%. Furthermore, ownership of financial assets features prominently among the factors that influence wealth inequality. What this means is that we do not need education instead of redistribution. To make a decisive break with the trappings of the past, we need both. The future for the poor is also bleak, according to the World Bank. That is because wealth and poverty transfer across generations. At least a third of all children born to very poor parents will likely remain poor themselves, while children of rich parents will likely become rich. So wealth calcifies at the top and does not automatically trickle down. Since generally whites are at the top and Africans at the bottom of the economic ladder, the calcification of wealth means the continuation of white wealth and black poverty, unless there is a fundamental reorganization of the economic structures which changes the paradigm in favor of poor black South Africans. Not only do we face a crisis of inequality, recent data shows a regression from the initial achievements of the first decade of democracy. Only in November 2023, the journalist Estelle Ellis of the Daily Maverick published a story which showed that between August 2022 and September 2023, there were 1,722 cases of malnutrition in children in the Eastern Cape. Of these malnourished children, 101 had died, as did another 13 who were diagnosed with moderate to severe acute malnutrition. There were also thousands more who presented with symptoms of malnutrition. If the data from Daily Maverick is to be perceived as anecdotal, it is also confirmed by the South African Human Rights Commission, which reported in 2022 that at least 25% of children born in the Eastern Cape are stunted. The problem of lack of access to food is slow violence. It is also structural because we live in a country of plenty. In a country of massive food wastage, it is violent because we can end malnutrition, but we have children dying of hunger and starvation. Unlike the malnourished children of the Eastern Cape, many of us have a lot more. This is why it is fair to refer to it as structural violence. It's deliberate violence on the poor. Of course, this is not the full story. Sambi Teblanche argued that one of the most remarkable developments in the first years of the democratic state has been the enrichment of the top 20% of African households and the simultaneous impoverishment of the bottom 40%. While the income of the top 20% of African households, about 6 million people, increased by more than 60%, that of the bottom 40%, that is 18 million people, declined by almost 60%. In certain quarters, there is some criticism about the emergence of the so-called black elite. Teblanche, however, considers this development a healthy phenomenon, without which a new South Africa would not have been possible. But I argue that this development underscores a broader issue, that the development of the black elite has coincided with the development of a black underclass. Current discourses on inequality tend to mask the truth of the superclass-underclass dynamic that is South Africa's reality. While the evidence of a causal connection, or what in law we call causal nexus, between these two phenomena is unclear, they can both be seen as byproducts of societal transformation. The upward mobility of some black people is explained by the shift in political power from white minority rule to a representative government, which opened the possibilities of social and economic advancement where they previously did not exist. The explanation, however, for the deterioration in the living standards of the black underclass presents certain complexities. It can be explained by apartheid racism or its endurance. Governmental and institutional collapse, we've seen a lot of evidence on this. A stagnant economy unable to produce sustainable employment opportunities. And quite frankly, the indifference of the emerging black elite towards the plight of the poor. These factors combined appear to have entrenched the poverty of the black underclass. The larger point, however, remains. We are in a crisis of inequality. We have a constitution which promotes equality, but a society which has produced inequality. We have a pro-poor constitution producing anti-poor outcomes. I do not know why this is so, but it is the most important question for constitutionalists like myself. I think the problem lies in part in a restrictive interpretation of the Constitution as an instrument to regulate public affairs and social relations, but never an instrument to regulate economic power. It is as if the economy operates outside the framework of the Constitution. The last major policy intervention by the ANC government in the sphere of economic equality was the Black Economic Empowerment legislation in 2003. But let us face it, black economic empowerment has not addressed inequality. In fact, despite the claim in its preamble that the Act is intended to address economic inequality, the structure of the Act simply cannot solve the crisis of inequality. My point is that if we accept that the Constitution has a particular conception of society, being egalitarianism, then we must also accept the link between that society and the determinant economic structure. Therefore, what we are yet to contend with is what is the economic vision of the Constitution. An equal society cannot be founded on economic injustice. That is simply a contradiction in terms. There are many things that can be done to resolve the crisis of economic injustice. It is beyond the scope of this lecture to itemize them. My intention is to make the obvious point that the Constitution is a manifesto for economic justice. Therefore, the crisis of inequality is a crisis of constitutionalism. But it is only constitutionalism that can resolve inequality, not cheap, empty, populist slogans. Constitutionalism faces another malcontent, judicial supremacy and a representative parliament. On the 14th of February, 1995, Nelson Mandela inaugurated the first constitutional court. In his speech, he said that the survival of democracy in South Africa depends on the Constitutional Court. In saying so, he was not conceding democratic power to an unelected branch of government. Instead, he was giving due recognition to the role of the judicial branch in holding the two other branches to the spirit and letter of constitutionalism. Yet, in recent times, Mandela's wish for the role of the judiciary in the new South Africa has been called into question. More forcefully than ever before, the call for a return to parliamentary supremacy is made. Sometimes they refer to it as parliamentary sovereignty, as if these two terms mean the same thing. We have been here before. The very idea that Parliament is supreme is an imperial idea. It was introduced into this country when the British were the imperialist power of the Cape and Natal in the 19th century. The nationalists also embraced it and applied the doctrine notoriously during the case of the 1950s known as Harris versus Minister of Interior. That case involved the Separate Representation of Voters Act of 1951, which was passed to give effect to apartheid by the removal of coloureds from the common voters' roll. But it was contended that this law was in contravention of the requirements of two-thirds majority of members of both houses of parliament in terms of section 152 of the founding law of the Union of South Africa, passed in 1909, known as the South Africa Act. The government lost the case, with the appellate division finding that section 152 of the Union Act was an entrenched clause. It had the status of a constitution. But the government simply passed another law, the High Court of Parliament Act. Its aim was to make Parliament the ultimate court of appeal in constitutional matters and enabled Parliament to set aside by simple majority any court judgment that invalidated an Act of Parliament. By a pen stroke, the Separate Representation of Voters Act was reintroduced. The appellate division struck down the Act for the second time. Now it held that the High Court of Parliament was a court only in name. In substance, it was Parliament dressed in judicial robes. You remove the robes, the iron fist of politics emerges. The nationalists were not yet finished. The 1953 elections were held under the Separate Representation Act. Malan told the public that he would not obey the courts. Only in 1955 did the nationalists take their final steps to overrule the courts. First, they reconstituted the Senate as the second chamber of parliament to ensure that they obtained the majority which they needed to disenfranchise coloureds. Secondly, they passed the Appellate Division Quorum Act. What this latter act did was to change the composition of the Appellate Division from 5 judges to 11 by adding 6. No doubt, the 6 had been carefully selected to avoid any further surprises. By the time the case came back to court, as Collins versus Minister of Interior, there was only one dissenter, Olive Schreiner. All 10 others voted to seal the fate of colored voters. This is what parliamentary sovereignty looks like for those who have not seen it. Of course, we seem to learn nothing from history. We are committed to repeating the errors of our ancestors. So if history teaches us nothing, perhaps some contemporary experience should. How about the idea that Parliament is a better vector of public opinion? I agree that it should be, but I am less assured that, in fact, it does. Manning has studied the evolution of what we mean by democracy in order to address the fallacy that seems immanent in the argument for parliamentary supremacy. Starting from Athens, where direct democracy was the norm, he has considered that, in fact, what happened in the 18th century was viewed as a rejection of democracy in favor of representative government. Yet there is something enigmatic in the idea of democracy, which enables it to capture a range of divergent perspectives, sometimes in tension with each other and often in conflict. Nevertheless, Manning writes, what we have today in the form of the parliamentary system is a form of republicanism, not democracy. Republicanism was itself an elite revolt against democracy. The point here is that the contrast between the people on the one hand and the courts on the other is an illusory one. In practice, Parliament often stands against the people, even though it purports to act in their name. It is the courts who have often reminded parliamentarians that lawmaking is not a function of a select few, but a function of the multitudes. There are just too many cases to recount in this regard. And the party system has fared no better either. Rather than dismantle the elitism, the political party system has entrenched it. When the Constitution was adopted, it was hoped that the party system would produce an accountable, transparent, and responsive government. The electoral system was designed to favor political parties with this expectation in mind. Experiences now, some 30 years later, suggest that there was no justification to entrust political parties exclusively with holding political power in the first place. No reason, therefore, to silence the voices of Athens. This is what the Constitutional Court attempted to do in the case of New Nation Movement, when it ruled that the monopoly of electoral power by political parties is not consistent with the type of democracy which is entrenched in our Constitution. In other words, the Constitution's conception of political power is wider, more diffuse, and more representative than the party system allows. Of course, the Constitutional Court has no lawmaking power. Inevitably, the decision had to be taken by the same political parties who, perhaps predictably, acted in their own interests. They squandered the chance to expand the scope of participation in our democratic system. They narrowed down the possibility of new voices. They squeezed out alternative perspectives to reimagine the democratic system, to take us beyond what had become a stale, unimaginative politics. And it is not as if there were no comparable examples to learn from. A full constituency model had been recommended by Dr. Van Zyl Slabbert, but it is clearly not serving the political elites. It was entirely predictable that, as with the May election, that the outcome would be an opaque election system and the manipulation of the party lists by crafty bosses of the parties. Things are not going to improve, I'm afraid to say. It seems that what is required to meet the demands of the New Nation movement is a full recast of the electoral system to entrench the silent voices of Athens. A constituency model alongside a party list system carries the best prospect towards this end. And so, my friends, the struggle for the democratization of parliament should not be taken for granted. It is a struggle that continues. Transformation has also been touted as a reason for the demand to return to parliamentary supremacy. The argument is that the judiciary has constrained transformation and that parliament will likely achieve transformation quicker. It is so that one of the functions of the judiciary is to put brakes on the misuse of power. Sometimes misuses of power take place in the name of the greater good. Take, for instance, the destruction of the rule of law in Zimbabwe in the name of land reform. In fact, it is precisely in the area of land and property transformation that critics argue that the Constitution and the judiciary have been anti-transformative. There is some cachet to the argument. Only 6 years ago, the National Assembly adopted a motion to investigate possible constitutional changes to Section 25 of the Constitution, ostensibly to enable a faster pace to land reform and empower the state to expropriate land without compensation, some would say without comprehension. While that process ended inconclusively, it still remains the case that critics say that Section 25 is a constraint to transformation of property relations. Hence, they say what they now want is a 2/3 majority to liberate us from a Western-imposed liberal constitution which entrenches property rights. Constitutionalists like me have tended to be impatient with the argument as an attack on the Constitution itself. I now think we should take the arguments seriously. It is possible that what they are saying resonates with some in society. After all, it has become difficult to explain to ordinary South Africans why, if we have a good constitution, it is unable to deliver land to us. The text of Section 25 itself cannot be squared up with a restrictive construct which entrenches property rights. It simply does not do so. In fact, during the multi-party negotiations at CODESA and at the Constitutional Assembly, the question whether or not South Africa should have a property clause at all was debated, and specifically whether land should be included in property. There was a view that if a property clause of whatever formulation is included in the Constitution, its effect would be to protect white property privileges inherited from the past. Ultimately, the agreement was to include a property clause, but it was not the same property clause that was advocated for by the National Party and the Democratic Party, whose arguments included the absolute and unqualified right to property. Right at its outset, Section 25(1) protects everyone from deprivation of property except through a law of general application, and says that no law may permit arbitrary deprivation. This clause has been referred to as a negative protection of private property. It has been said that this inevitably privileges those with property at the expense of the propertyless. I think this is true, but if history illuminates interpretation, the intention, at least in part, was to protect the many black people who were victims of forced removals under the Natives Land Act, the Group Areas Act, and arbitrary state action under apartheid. If we return to Section 25, what is apparent is that its purpose is not to entrench private property, but to transform it. This appears from most of its substantive provisions, by guaranteeing the right of restitution to victims of forced removals from the 19th of June 1913, empowering the state to expropriate private property, including land, in the public interest and for public purposes, and mandating the state to ensure security of tenure and access to land on an equitable basis. So read holistically, the function of Section 25 of the Constitution is to transform property relations. Perhaps in 1994, all property acquired under apartheid and colonialism should have been forfeited to the state. And perhaps the Truth and Reconciliation Commission should have focused on land dispossession as a manifestation of gross violations of human rights. And perhaps 1913 should not have been chosen as a cutoff point in the case of restituted land. Many things, I agree, could have been done differently. But the transition was a messy time, and the country an even messier place. We are now all better with the benefit of hindsight. We could have done things better. But we don't know for those people who were there, like Nelson Mandela, who were at the forefront. What we can see now, after 30 years, is that the 1994 constitutional moment opened the possibility of real and meaningful reforms. In land, we missed those real and meaningful reforms. And here, it is not the law, but ourselves who should be asking for answers. Recent suggestions about giving the land to the custody of traditional leaders or placing it under the state control simply prove the poverty of ideas that has permeated our political system. These ideas are presented as if they are African, as if in an African system, traditional leaders, quote unquote, own the land. But in an illuminating judgment of the KwaZulu-Natal Provincial Division, brought by the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, Judge Mjabuliseni Madondo has put paid to the lie of the king as owner of the land. In terms of Zulu customary law, the judge has explained, each family head has the right to be allotted a family home site, arable land, and a right to graze his livestock on pasture land. When this land is allotted to an individual, there is no purchase price or rental. Once allotted, the right to hold the land is sacrosanct in that it is inviolable and passes from generation to generation. It becomes the property of the individual family. What this means is that no king, no traditional leader, no chief, no headman can interfere with the rights of an individual over the land. To argue then that our traditional system entrusts ownership of the land to the king is to distort true customary law. When the Constitution recognizes customary law, it does not intend to resuscitate colonial and apartheid versions of it, which increased the power of the chiefs and placed them above the people. Instead, it intends to empower the people so that they can exercise their own self-determination, sometimes against the chiefs. Forgive me, I am approaching the end. In chapter 1 of the Communist Manifesto, Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx write that all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. In 1994, we had Nelson Mandela to take the leadership to move the country from the crisis of apartheid, to chart a new path for the future. We did not have to do it ourselves. And to do this, Mandela did not need to know what the future would look like. And he did not need to know whether he would succeed or not. He also did not need to be free of doubt, just like his decision on the 16th of December, 1961, to form Umkhonto weSizwe. He did not know, nor did he need to know, that Umkhonto weSizwe would be a success. Mandela now, if you know what I mean. Mandela is now no more. We are compelled to quote Engels and Marx, to face with sober senses our real conditions of life and our relations with our kind. For constitutionalism to survive, the Constitution itself must not only be a popular document, but it should be a living one too. But it is unable to be because of the widening gap between the ideal world which it describes and the expectations it promises on the one hand and the lived reality of many people. At first, there was optimism about the ability of the Constitution to deliver both on its potential and its promise. And then the optimism was replaced by disappointment and despair. Despair at the level of corruption that was eating away the fabric of the constitutional system, and the inability of the legal order to protect itself, unable to fight back, unable to protect the vulnerable. But I fear now that the initial disappointment and despair have been replaced by cynicism. The idea that it is everyone for himself. These days, many people shrug their shoulders or roll their eyes when they hear of another story of corruption. They also view voting as a charade, a performance, a spectacle. Nothing will change their reason. This is why many have long abandoned the ritual of voting. Like them, I'm afraid I have no words of inspiration for you. I have no words of appeal to the cynical and the disappointed to return to the tent of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism has had its trials. It has had its tribulations. At first, it tried to live up to its promise, but in the long run, it has not been able to deliver on its economic promise. It has been abused by some. But I'm a constitutionalist nevertheless. Despite its imperfections, its vulnerabilities, its apparent impotence in the face of raw power, I am yet to find a better system. In these days, where the promise of constitutionalism stands betrayed, it is easy to ask if constitutionalism is the problem. Yet, if we take a longer, wider historical trajectory, we can see that the preamble to our Constitution was written in blood. Perhaps there is another way of maintaining faith in the idea and the ideal of constitutionalism. On 10 August 1836, Dr. John Philip, a missionary of the Cape, reported to the London Missionary Society that extensive districts of the Eastern Cape that were once occupied by large, happy pastoral race, the Khoi, were left without people, except the occasional white intruder, holding farms of 10,000 acres, enjoying what he referred to as the grim tranquility of empty land. He continued, quote, "If a traveler who had visited South Africa 25 years ago were to take his stand on the banks of the Sundays River and ask what had become of the natives whom he saw there in his former visit, if he would take his stand again on the Fish River and thus extend his views to Kafraria, he might ask the same question. And were he to take a second stand upon the Snow Mountain behind Graaff-Reinet, he would have had before him a country containing 40,000 square miles and ask, where were the various tribes that he saw there 25 years ago? No man could tell him where they were." John Philip did not have the language to describe what he saw, but it all sounds like the genocide of the Khoi. It had all of the hallmarks of it, wiping out an entire peoples. Perhaps keeping faith in the constitutional system is about a reminder of this forgotten genocide of the Khoi and the San people, of their land that was confiscated by violence, of an affirmation of their cattle that was stolen by European invaders. In this sense, at least, the Constitution is the living spirit of the children of the San and the Khoi, whose little skulls were smashed by the European invaders against the unforgiving rocks of the mountains of the Cape. When all is said and done, as the Constitution embodies, there are multiple and painful pasts. These are the injustices of the past to which it pays homage. Its founders knew of these injustices firsthand, yet their views were to confront injustice with justice, colonialism with constitutionalism. By recalling the African origins of constitutionalism, we can perhaps make sense of its promise. The Constitution can, and perhaps once again, play its redemptive role. It can become our book of redemption. It can be a gift from our ancestors, our heritage. It can help us navigate the treacherous terrain of our present uncertain times. It can help us contend with the despair and the cynicism. You see, we created the Constitution. It belongs to us. It is one of the things that are genuinely ours, the people of South Africa. It is ours, but having made it, now we must live it. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm gobsmacked by the torrential, oracular wisdom that we've been witness to, that we've just been listening to. I think I'm with all of you in saying this was, both a maudlin, elegiac excursion, intellectual, political, economic excursion on our founding and its antecedents. In the end, as he was going through what has happened to this country, the betrayal of the constitutional promise, he sounded a little dispirited. He's been at the, what do we call it, Joel? When you are at the battlefront, there's a word we use, the barricades, the barricades of fighting for social justice. And it's not easy because perhaps, he does seem to think that we haven't moved the dial. In many respects, we have regressed from where we were in 1994 and the first 15 years of our republic. I think all the metrics point to that. All the metrics point to that the promise of the Constitution, which we were able, if you like, to eke out in the first 15 years. We're growing at 3.6%, Ngcukaitobi. We created 6 million jobs. We got out of junk status. In many respects, social transformation was beginning to be visible. Until, as you say, the corrupt malfeasance took over the ANC, and by extension, our government and state. So today, we're facing a revolt against what is our founding? The Constitution. We're facing a revolt from the populace because of the degeneration, the malfeasance have plunged us into. So now, suddenly, the Constitution is the enemy because people are not seeing any visible transformation of their lives in spite of this great document that is lauded the world over. So it is tantalizingly, it is tempting for people to say, let's toss the Constitution, let's junk the Constitution, and let's have parliamentary sovereignty, let's have parliamentary supremacy. Why should the minority, Zuma said this, why should the minority be accorded any status, any voice, because we are the majority? This is the kind of populist nonsense that has been assaulting our democracy. And as he says, we don't seem to have answers to this nonsense because there's been no change. We thought when Zuma was defenestrated, a new dawn was going to be upon us. Instead, metrics show that the condition of our people is worse off in the last 5 years of the new dawn than when Zuma was in charge, perhaps exacerbated by COVID and all other things. But when you look at things now, social scientists have been putting these metrics, across to say South Africans are poorer in 2024 than they were in 2017 at the end of the Zuma administration. But I say, Ngcukaitobi, despair not. No one ever said this was going to be an easy odyssey. Madiba was in jail for how many years? The Madiba that they call a sellout was in jail for 27 years. His family was ravaged. He went into jail as a 44-year-old man. I think he was younger than you, Ngcukaitobi. I think they're older than 44. He came out a 71-year-old man. And he used the last years of his life to fight for this constitution that we're talking about, to give our people the promise of a new possibility. And it is that which we must defend now with our lives, with our ideation, with our intellection, with everything in our being. Recently, a call has been made that, after 30 years, surely it is time to ponder and reflect on where is our democracy. What is the state, the condition of our republic? And I think it's just told us, and I think we know that the state of our republic is broken. The spirit of our democracy is ailing. They say only 39% of our people bother to turn out to vote. Only 39%. Maybe there could be some disputation, around the numbers. But what is incontestable is that more people stayed at home than those who went to vote. Now, what does that say? That is a terrible indictment after only 30 years. And we do know when people lose faith in politics and voting as a lever for transformational change, what do? Oscar? They self-provide. They engage in violence and mayhem. And we know this is a very violent country. If there's one thing that we have not been able to dispense with, is our violent propensity, which is why most of us live behind high walls, hide behind high walls, in fear of our own who are down on their luck. And the character of South African criminality is violent. Remember, Joel, the peer review mechanism when you were still in government by Professor Adv. He found South Africa to say that this country is not free. This country is characterized by unfreedom. And what did he attribute that to? To the violent nature of South African crime. And if you have the levels of poverty, the levels of unemployment in this country, I mean, it is said now that 42% using the broader measure. The broader measure means those who are no longer looking for employment. Now, if you've got 42% unemployment in any society, especially as violent as ours, what do you expect? Violence, criminality, rape, all manner of social pathologies. But I'm saying, my younger brother, we need to engage in a national dialogue to examine the condition of our republic and find answers to our difficulties. And these difficulties, as you say correctly, are not going to be found by the political elites. 4,000 people who gather at Nazareth and actually effectively elect our president. It's going to have to be a bottoms-up, citizen-wide initiative of our people telling us, defining the South Africa we want, and what it is that has become a fetter to that dream. So I'm saying there is Tembeka, you know, it seems to me that's one thing we could try, you know, to reinvigorate the spirit of our democracy because it is broken. Now, he took us down, you know, on a tour of constitutionalism, and he refuted the canard, the lie, that this constitution is a Western imposition. I mean, he takes it from 1918 with Richard Msimang, the ANC Constitution, 1923 with the Bill of Rights, 1943 with African claims. And by the way, I'm also a big Gquma man, you know. And our chairman here at MISTRA, Professor Vilngomo, knew, you know, A.B. Gquma, you know. I wish he was here, he could tell us more about him, you know. And another one called Peter Vundla, you know. So, and in spite of his greatness, reviving a moribund ANC that had almost been destroyed by Pixley Kaisaga Seme, his own founder. I wish Ngulunga was here. Where is he? But what was his reward? Defenestration from office because the young Turks around Mandela, Sisulu, and Tama found him insufficiently militant, you know. But this is what happens in politics. Thabo Mbeki, all the figures that I've enumerated here about the growth in the last 15 years, sorry, in the first 15 years, what was Thabo Mbeki's reward? Defenestration by his own party and actually humiliation. He was humiliatingly recalled from office before his term was over. This is sort of the political game. This is a political animal. It is unforgiving, and it does strange things. But with that, I want to invite Professor Fritz Nganje, to come and engage with some of the things that Tembeka, you know, has shared with us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Program Director. Let me start by thanking Advocate Ngcukaitobi for the insightful lecture. Actually, everyone I spoke to about this lecture remarked that actually they did predict the quality and outcome of the lecture, and I think I speak for everyone that you did not disappoint. Thank you so much. And I think we should also thank the program director for the good response to the lecture. Yeah. So my task this evening is to transform the lecture into a dialogue. And so we'll open up without wasting any more time to questions. We do recognize that we have both an in-house audience and an audience online. So we're going to take, Advocate, if you don't mind, a round of 3 questions, beginning here and before we move to the audience online. Hopefully, if we are not able to get all the questions during this session, we'll engage with you during the refreshment. So let's start here in-house. Could you please attempt to keep your question brief and to the point. Let's not have another lecture. Kindly introduce yourself and then ask your questions.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Prof. Thank you, Tembeka. All I can say is two words: beautiful and provocative, and that was to be expected from you. There's a point I agree with you on, there's a point I disagree with you on. There's many points I agree with you on, there's many points I don't agree with you on. But I'm just going to limit them to two so that I don't waste time and afford other colleagues. My name is David Maimela. I used to be a researcher at MISTRA. Tembeka, I agree with you when you say that maybe, or actually, this is actually a matter of fact, that the constitutional crisis we face today is on the basis, or actually lies at the back of the economic crisis that we face. So I agree with you on that, absolutely. So that there is no society that can build legitimacy and social cohesion so much that people can observe and respect the law, the constitutional order, and so on, if their quality of life does not improve. So that's, you take the white racist state in South Africa. The reason why the minority or the smaller group of white population could see the white racist state as legitimate in their eyes, it was because it could deliver on the economic front. So I agree with you on that. So now the question then comes exactly at that whether you go to Japan, the Asian tigers, whether you go to China and so on, the bottom line is that all the states have to build their economic legitimacy, both in state and society, on the basis of economic success. Now, where I disagree with you on is on the political, on the political comment you made about your suggestion that maybe a constituency system can assist. I don't think so. I don't think so either, because I proceed from the premise that society is organized around interests. Society is organized around interests. In the local government sphere, even with ward councillors, the people who actually win more wards are those that are organized under political parties, interestingly. And yet the people there at local government have the freedom to actually choose people from a constituency of their own. And I don't want to talk about the example of America. I study America more than I study South Africa, by the way. I don't want to talk about the example of America, which pretends to be a two-party state when actually it's one-party state with two factions. And as I always say, Joel, you must quote me on this one finally, because I quote you sometimes. Just sometimes. You see, it doesn't matter in the United States as to who becomes president and which party is actually president. The White House remains the same. It doesn't matter. And that's why they behave the same on the Palestinian question and so on and so on. So for me, it doesn't matter. The entire Congress is actually bought by the organized interests there. So the issue is that, for me, it's on the balance. My last comment is that it's on the balance of the power of the people to organize and navigate within the organized interests and actually rise above them and contain them. For me, that's what is very much important, because in any case, the constituency system, and as much as the party system, can actually be bought.
Thank you so much. My name is Sanjay Chabalala. I just want to really appreciate the lecture and how you mentioned children's rights. And I think my question has to do with what do you think is the socioeconomic remedies towards really seeing a better enforcement of children's rights in South Africa? I know we are quite advanced in terms of legislating a lot of the instruments that are there to protect and advance children's rights, but I think we're more and more seeing that because they don't vote and because their voices are limited, there isn't really a fair enjoyment of those rights, even though those instruments are there. And I think also to highlight that today, what we saw in Katlehong, I'm not sure if it's today or yesterday, but I think children as activists, I'd just like to know from your point of view, how do we see children as citizens with power? And I'd just like to know your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Tembeka, thank you very much for a thought-provoking input. What I want to ask is, a few years ago, MISTRA, at one of the annual lectures, we invited the Deputy Chief Justice, Msoneke, to deliver the lecture. And one of the profound points he made is, in his almost more than 20 years of being at the apex court, not once was a matter on the land question brought to the Constitutional Court, not even where it was where the state wanted to appropriate without compensation, etc. And so he concluded by saying, either you're doing everything absolutely right or you're doing absolutely nothing with regards to the land question. And coupled with that, as you know or might not know, the former President Kgalema Motlanthe, in his report to Parliament, commissioned by Parliament, recommended that we use legislation to redress the land issue, very much in the same way the 1913 Act was used and so on. So my question to you is it lack of political will? Is it that we don't know what the consequences are going to be to actually address private property relations? Why is it that it is not actually being tackled, and why is the law not being used more effectively to try and redress the issue of land? Thank you.
Let me just use the opportunity to bring in one question from the online audience, which asks whether there are any parts of the Constitution that need to be updated. Advocate?
Yeah, I mean, it always happens like this, where I don't have the answers, you know what I mean? So my point is to point to the problems, right? That's the role of an intellectual society, and then to provoke a conversation around those issues. I do have answers on the land issue, because out of everything I've studied, that's the one I've studied more than others, and written 250 pages on it, given to the government. The government did nothing about it. And they get surprised when they get 40%. Then they wonder why, But there it is. You promise people land, you never gave it to them. Oh, sorry, yeah. No, I apologize. No, I was criticizing the ANC government again. So. No, I think on land, what the ANC did is totally inexcusable. It's really, really inexcusable. In the CODESA and Constitutional Assembly, they faced a formidable opponent in the National Party. Sheila Kamara was the spokesperson on property. Very, very, very formidable, right? On 3 issues. 1, do we need a property clause? Number 2, do we need a right of restitution, right of return? Number 3, do we need the power of expropriation? The ANC won all of them. Like, they won each and every one of those arguments. They got it in. is no right to property. There is a right of the state to expropriate. There is a right of return. They are all in the Constitution. Very few countries have constitutionalized property transformation to that extent. Very few, you see, because everyone is so touched when it comes to property. Property is almost perceived as an extension of yourself, perceived in the same category as a freedom of speech, but it is not, because property is an external thing to a human, but it's a human right, you know. So now, after they won this discussion, they won everything. And they signed the Constitution in 1996. Signed it 31st of May 1996. They signed it. The following year, in 1997, they adopted a white paper on land. What did it do? The first thing it did was that land would be acquired on a willing seller, willing buyer basis as a government policy, which was a complete betrayal of what they had just achieved a year earlier. The consequence has been that since 1997, since the white paper, the policy of the state has been to acquire land for all purposes on market-related standards. Sometimes, and I've spoken to the Department of Housing, how do you acquire land if you want to build a township? They pay on what they call the best possible use, best and highest possible use of the land, which is more than the market value. It's more than the market value. You know, this is why when I asked the minister, the former Minister of Land Affairs at Gibbs, I think in 2017, I asked, how much has your government paid for land reform since you became the government in 1994? How much have you paid? So 60 billion. So I asked, where's the money gone? You see, where's the money gone? And then he says, well, the majority of it has gone to white farmers, white landowners. I said, but don't you think this is a scandal that you got upset and then, you know, became personal and the conversation ended? It was, no, it was not Togotidis. Togotidis has probably been one of the better ministers. No. It was Mashabane. Yes. Maite Ngwane Mashabane. Yeah, she was the minister. Yeah, exactly. You see, so and the conversation ended there. So where you've got the law on your side, the right to expropriate, it's there, it's written in black and white. And you've got the right of return, it's also there, it's black and white. And you have no right to property. Why have they not done anything about land? Like, what's the reason? You know? Now, the same thing in 2018, they had these discussions, went around the country. They were asking people, do you want land? So this was a referendum. They asked black people, do you want land? What did they think the answer was going to be? I mean, and this thing went on for 8 months. For 8 months. Today they are in Limpopo, tomorrow they're in Mpumalanga, the other day they're in the Eastern Cape, and then a lot of people go into this meeting. So what is the question on the referendum? Do you want land? I mean, so something else has been going on in the government, which it's impossible for me to understand. You know, but it's got nothing to do with the law. It's got nothing to do with the policy. And by the way, you know, I'm glad you've raised this question. The person who spoke the most about being committed to transformation was Jacob Zuma. But when you actually look at budgetary allocations for land, there was a decline in the budget allocated for land during his presidency. That decline has continued under Ramaphosa's government. And the area where there was the greatest redistribution of land was Mandela and Thabo Mbeki. In fact, even Thabo Mbeki, it was in the first 5 years of his government, where you see a real increase in the redistribution of land and a real increase in the budget. Thereafter, they took their eyes off the ball. They just did nothing about it. So I was at the last ANC conference in Nasrec, and I went specifically to the Commission on Economic Transformation, because that's where I saw that the land issue was going to be discussed. I went to that commission. I just wanted to listen. Like, why are we doing nothing about it? And I was just shocked at the nonsense that was espoused, because it was a repetition of what landowners want. You know. So what I found is that the land policy, the actual land policy, is driven by white property interests. So they will talk about, I mean, one of the suggestions was, what about donations, land donations? You cannot have a land strategy that's dependent on donations. I mean, this just doesn't work. So you say, what is it, political will, etc. I just don't know. I'm completely puzzled to explain and understand the ANC's reluctance to address land. The Constitutional Court has also said this. It says we just don't understand. You know, the Supreme Court of Appeal says the same thing. When I was acting judge in the Land Claims Court, I just couldn't understand. I just found the cases I did, 70% of them were eviction cases. It was landowners evicting black people from land. And the government was almost like impotent. There's nothing we can do about it. But this is a court you've established for transformation. And why is it not doing its job? You know? So I still cannot understand what's wrong with the ANC and its approach. Let's ask Comrade Jewel. Because I speak as an outsider. I really speak as an outsider, just completely puzzled at why have these people behaved like this. It's just impossible for me to understand. What I have seen in the Eastern Cape, they do have a land redistribution program. The problem has been recorded in a report published by the UWC outfit, where they say that the beneficiaries, they call this elite capture. Beneficiaries of land reform are people that are politically connected, or they have families working there, etc. They're not real farmers, you know. They're part-time farming. They go there on the weekends and they throw a big part, but they're not really farmers, you know. And those are the people that are really at the forefront. And that is also confirmed by the report by the SIU. I quoted that report in my book, the SIU, which showed 1 in every 4 land claims is corrupt. 1 in every 4 land claims is corrupt. It's astonishing. 25% of all land claims are corrupt. The figures are just astonishing. So if you have a country as corrupt as South Africa, I think it's inevitable that an asset as important as land would also be corrupt. So unless someone actually addresses the structural problems with it, I mean, I think we're going to go nowhere. But what is the explanation? I just don't know. It's just impossible to understand. David, I see your point about you saying that the party, okay, fine. The fact is that, you know, sometimes, you know, just like sometimes you just wonder what's going on in this country, because it's the party system that has got us where we are. So something radical has to change. You know, it's the party system. We're here because of the party system. So another defense of the party system means another 30 years of the crisis. You know, so that's what I fully grasp about the thing. Sure, you don't like a constituency model, but the mishmash of independence and individuals that the ANC produced, because it was the majority in that committee, and look at what it produced. Even when you went to vote, you just didn't understand what is the region, what is the province, how does it differ, etc. You know, because what they were trying to do, they were trying to avoid a full-scale constituency model. They thought they were protecting the party. What they produced in the end was this idea that you, as David, you can just compile a list without any names and then fill it up as you go along. Or you can compile a list with names that you took from your village. And then when you get elected, it's only then that you will choose which names will go forward. This is enabled by the ANC because it could have changed the system so that it makes it truly representative. And sure, it may not be a constituency model, but this current model, I don't know if you say, well, the current model works, because the current model has produced the kind of non-participation by the public. And that's the only point I was trying to surface, is that this system has been rejected by voters. You know, but sure, I mean, if the ANC wants to continue like this, fine. You know, then in the next election, then maybe we'll have a new government. You know, so not a GNU of some sort. Yeah. So I think I don't have to answer everything. So what should I say now? The children's rights, yeah. I don't know what needs to be done. But what I do think is a problem is what is going on right now. Other countries have got different models, by the way. We do have it even here. Children's parliament, that's another model. Even at local government level, having specific committees that are focused on children. Even participation at school committee level, having specific committees that are focused on children and that run by children. But that's not the point I was trying to make. The point I was trying to make is that for the first time since 1994, we now have children dying of malnutrition. And they are dying of malnutrition in circumstances that are avoidable. You see, that is the real crisis of constitutionalism. Is why is this constitution producing stunted children? So that's the question. And the problem with stunted children is also because they are the most vulnerable. They are unlike me and you, who can make noise, but they can't make noise. So there's something wrong in a society that produces stunted children in the land of plenty. I understand if we're all poor, but the point is that we've got this 20% that is enjoying 80% of the economic rewards, and the 80% that has to share the 20%.
I just want to abuse my prerogative as the program director. What does Einstein say about doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result? I think he says it's a definition of madness. I think anyone who can genuinely say the kind of voter system that we have that has been rejected by our people, I mean, if 39% of eligible voters show up, why would you want to continue with that? Surely, I mean, you should at least say, can we examine something else? But to actually double down on a voter system, electoral system that has been comprehensively rejected by our people, to me, it's just, it's crazy, it's humbug.
Advocate, I want to take some questions from the online audience. Yes, no, I'll come to you guys. Just let's address our colleagues who are online. There is a question from Mutlong who wants to know your thoughts about the place of traditional leadership in a constitutional order.
Can I answer that now?
Yes.
Oh, apparently they can't hear what I'm saying. All right, I apologize. Now, let's talk about the traditional leaders. I think the point I was making about traditional leaders is the distortion. There are, maybe 3 issues to say about traditional leaders. Firstly, what is their place in a system of wall-to-wall municipalities? And when I say wall-to-wall, it's truly wall-to-wall. There is not a single square meter in this country that is not governed by a democratically elected institution. It's wall-to-wall, 123 million square meters in this country. It's all regulated by law. It's all covered in the Systems Act, Structures Act. But every inch of this country is under a democratically elected system. Now, this was the crisis that faced the ANC, right, about what to do with traditional institutions and traditional leaders. Because on the one hand, they tell us is democratization, but on the other, you are faced with the reality that traditional institutions exist. So what they did, they then included them in section 211, 212, 213, 214 of the Constitution. Say, the institution exists, it must function according to customary law, and it must find expression in parliament as well as in local government. But what is its power? Right? So that crisis of what is its power has not been resolved, and it stands in tension with democracy. Because the idea is that traditional institutions and traditional leaders are not exercising democratic power. That's not the same thing as saying they're not exercising legitimate power, but it's not democratic power, it's not people's power, you see. It could be inherited power, it could be other forms of power, but it's not people's power, and it always stays in tension with, and in fact, that's why some of these arguments, some people say, okay, we don't want the judges, but we want traditional leaders. So like, what are you talking about? So the first thing is if South Africa is serious about the wall-to-wall system, then power belongs to elected institutions. Political power belongs to elected institutions. And then what is the residual role then of traditional leaders? And maybe it's custom, right? Because the Constitution says functioning in accordance with customary law. So it's preservation of culture, it's preservation of custom. That's fine, because South Africa is, multicultural society. So preservation of custom, sure, I accept and I agree with that. But, and here's the problem. Custom is a community thing. It is a family thing, you see. So the idea of custom from above is actually against true customary law, because true customary law gives the voices of the people from below. That's what it listens to, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing has been control over land, and that is where the real disputes have been, is who controls the land. It's a Shepstone idea, or Shepstonian idea, like Theophilus Shepstone. The report he published 1844 to 1846 on the Natives Land Commission in Zululand. What they did with that is they reorganized what they refer to as tribes. They dismissed those chiefs they did not like. They appointed new chiefs, and then they recreated new tribes. If you remember, 1873, Benjamin Pine issued a proclamation in which he said, the Hlubi tribe is from henceforth destroyed. It's no longer recognized as a tribe, the tribe of the Hlubis. This is the end of the tribe of the Hlubis from today onwards. And the chief, or the king, Langalbalel, is no longer recognized, taken to a trial and then sent to Robben Island. End of the tribe of the Hlubis. So the question then that arises is, what is their authority vis-a-vis the land, right? Now, the Shepstone idea was that in order to control the multitudes of native people, the chiefs, those that he approved of, right, had to be given control over ownership of the land. But that meant that you had to take the land from the people that were the actual owners of the land, right? Either you put it in the form of trusteeship or you put it in actual ownership. But you see, over time, we've now accepted this notion that chiefs own the land. But it's actually an anti-customary position, because the true customary position is that the land belongs to the people. It may be administered by the chief for functional reasons, but the ownership belongs to the people. And this is the problem we've had with Ingonyama Trust, which is why they got cross with me the other day, because I made this point that they are not the owners of the land. The owners of the land are the people living in Zululand at 2.5, 2.7 million hectares, etc. So ownership of the land belongs to the people, doesn't belong to the chiefs. Then the final point is, who is the source of customary law? Right? Who is the source of customary law? So where do you go to know? Okay, well, lobola is also a controversial thing, because this was a law by Shepstone again, decided, 11 cows. It's not actually Zulu law. Shepstone just thumbsucked this thing up. So we have to transform custom, and the Constitution says custom must be transformed. We have to transform custom in order to address the problem of colonial distortions. You see. Unfortunately, as we do so, all of the privileges that the chiefs and the traditional leaders have received from apartheid and colonialism, they want to preserve them. And one of them was the control of land. You see. Now, unfortunately, the ANC government has gone along with the chiefs. Right? They have this fallacious idea that if you go with the chiefs, you will go with the people. They don't understand that there's a fundamental conflict and a tension. I mean, the one good example, many cases I've done in this, one good example is if an owner of a mineral right wishes to exploit the minerals, who should they consult with? Take the example of Kolobeni. They did have the consent of the headman and the chief, but they did not have the consent of the community. And the government allowed them to proceed on the basis of the consent by the chief. Precisely, and so, and what happened? They also bought the chief a 4x4 vehicle. It was there in the papers. So they got a 4x4. You know, Chief Balen got a 4x4. And you can go there, Limpopo, you can go to Northwest, you can go to everywhere you go, in case everywhere you go, you've got the same problem, where there is a coalescence of interest between the politicians, the chiefs, and mine bosses. Right. It's not a surprise that the people are revolting against the party. You know, it's not a surprise. These are things we've seen over and over again. Again, I wrote about this. It's in Land Matters. I wrote about this problem, what I call chiefly power. I wrote about this problem of chiefly power. But the ANC government has refused to respond to this crisis. This is a real crisis. I mean, Xolobeni was a very, very good example, you know, where we had 98% of all households rejecting mining. 98% rejecting mining. And the government imposing it. Like imposing it against the interests of the communities. So I'm glad here we have the professor who's now taking over as CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Because, well, he's seated there. Because he actually knows what I'm talking about, because he is one of the experts, foremost experts, on this conflict between the people and the traditional institutions. So if you want to ask, you can ask him.
Okay, yes, ma'am. Can we have the mic?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tembeka, for a brilliant delivery. I really appreciated the framing of it and what you've covered. And I want to get straight to the point around the scourge of corruption and link it to the point or the case that was made about what I think is unforgivable in the Eastern Cape of kids dying from malnutrition. And I think part of that is that relevant ministries and departments were sending back budgets around that. The AG's report is evident around the least performing, the most corrupt provinces, and we see that in the Eastern Cape. And so, whilst it's more important to look at the history, corruption is clearly undermining everything. It's undermining our progress. It's undermining growth. It's, you know, everything. And so it's captured the state really. So, what, in your view, you know, do you, I'm wondering what you're thinking about recommendations or reforms that can really critically shift the needle in this space. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Mokhaile Mogashwa. I come from an institution called Wikipedia. Thank you for the lecture, sir. It's very informative, and I unfortunately agree with one line you say in the lecture. Things are not about to get better. And the problem with that is, or the reason for that is, if you find a people that live on a law, for example, an African law, whatever you want to call it, is law. And then you install a new law on top of this law, you will have this noise. In engineering, we call it noise. So installing a Roman Dutch law on top of a law that governs a people is the noise that you see. So the problem we are experiencing is that noise. It is not imaginary that the European states that are leading in the world today are on that law, and we are these people and are expected to function on that same law. So we will forever trail these nations. It is the same reason in those countries, the president or the prime ministers reports to the monarchs. And then when you install that law here, the chiefs or the kings must report to the politicians. So it is a cacophony of a system. You'll never get a wave that you're looking for. So it's pretty simple and close. The reason we've got the problems that we have in this continent is not the politicians or the people, it is the reason that we must operate on a Roman Dutch law. It is not a law that is going to work for us. And it is, yes, I'm closing. You'll also, pick up examples like in the first ever, for example, TB patient that was ever in this country was treated by a Bantu healer and was healed, not treated, he was healed completely. But because of the systems that must be used, we can't heal people, we must put them on several years of a treatment and then try work along those systems. So we're not about to get out of the hole, unfortunately, if,
Thank you very much. John Rowett, University of Oxford, and Three Oceans Foundation. You spoke about the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, which is essentially a doctrine of elective dictatorship, as an English Lord Chancellor called it. And in the discussions that Oliver Tambo was having in the 1980s, he was living through an elective dictatorship of a really crass sort in the UK and discussing with Sonny Ramphal, a leading lawyer and Secretary General of the Commonwealth, the issues around elective dictatorship, tied in directly with exactly what you said about the imposition of elective dictatorship here. I wonder to what extent you think that in those discussions, because that was the central concern, they neglected really to focus on other issues. You mentioned education, for example, education solving poverty. Well, any educational sociology of the UK and the US would have said you cannot compensate for asset inequality and market-generated inequality by education. And so to what extent do you think there was a too easy assumption that was being, understandable why, but a too easy assumption that the Constitution could deal with those patterns of rooted inequality?
This. I think let's allow Sanji as the last speaker there, and then we can if you don't mind.
Thanks very much. I hope I understood what you're saying. If I butcher it, please help me along with some kindness. I think at some point you quote Madiba on the Constitutional Court, and I think the government and the working of that system. And I think at some point you also talk about maybe the judiciary has sort of constrained transformation. And I remember there was a conversation the JSC had with Judge Unterhalter on this issue where he's saying, this court has been hearing cases maybe it shouldn't be hearing or disrupting. I think it speaks to the ESCOM case where about, the judiciary will say, look, you are to do this or you are not to do this. And so this sort of policy or government action and courts and how that actually is an interaction here that might be actually disruptive. And I wonder if that's the kind of conversation he was having, or you heard him saying something different. Because I think from some experience that I've had in the public sector, one of the things that do happen sometimes is that a court will say, these people who have invaded this land, let's call it an invasion for the purposes of conversation, have invaded this land, may not be removed. And so that land maybe has been planned for moving in people from another area. And so what happens then that decision obviously holds back other sort of transformation where you would have been moving these people in, and so you sort of kick back that sort of transformation for some time to come, so you sort of distort the development that would have happened. Is this something that you are thinking about, or was this part of the conversation that we're having?
Thank you very much. No, I was saying that I think that the last two inputs are really excellent in terms of engaging with the substance of what I was trying to say. I think that the point about the conversation with Judge Unterhalter is a complex point. And I think in order for us to make it meaningful, we can concentrate on housing, which is the example you've chosen. In the early days, the ANC was extremely reluctant to sort of criminalize land occupation, and one can understand that it's a knee-jerk from the past. You know, it's because in the 1950s, it was a crime for black people to occupy land, you know, through various laws, etc. You know. And so at the beginning, one of the first things they did was to pass laws that decriminalize land occupation, you know, except that the common law continues, particularly laws like trespassing, etc. Right? But at the same time, they did not put developmental laws in place. In other words, if you decriminalize land occupation in a country where there is an acute shortage of housing, you know, how do you balance the two? So Joe Slovo was one of the best examples of the consequences of decriminalization. It's large numbers of people finding a spot outside of the city center in the Western Cape. Right. Yeah. No, yeah, Joe Slovo was a Minister of Housing, so maybe it makes sense. So the so-called the informal settlement in Joe Slovo, which was at the time the largest informal settlement, was an illustration of the tension, right? Because on the one hand, the government says, we need these people to live because we want to build houses, you know. But at the same time, these people have a right not to be evicted unless alternative housing has been found. And then they say, well, the demand for alternative housing is interfering with the plans for development, you know, and then that's where the tension is. But what we have seen, and I had sympathy at the time, right? 20 years ago, I was completely sympathetic. I am no longer sympathetic now because the promises of development have tend to be not, right? Every time the government uses the defense that it has identified a particular piece of ground for development, it has not in fact developed that piece of ground, even where the judges have assisted the government by ejecting those communities. By the way, in Joe Slovo, there was an eviction order. So they were never prevented by a court from developing Joe Slovo, right? And they started, and then they abandoned the project in the middle. Now you can go everywhere else, Port Elizabeth, Johannesburg, everywhere. The government now uses this. It's become a fig leaf almost, this fig leaf of development, as conflicting with people's entitlement to occupation, which is why today's policy is no longer the same as the policy they took under Joe Slovo. Today's policy is to actually criminalize land occupation by sending the red ants. So that's today's government policy. So in many respects, it's now the government against the people again, right? And the conduct is actually reminiscent of the apartheid conduct. They just don't call it that. But in practice, that is how they have behaved. So it is true, over time, this tension has exploded, you know. And I think that although we could have been sympathetic to the government 30 years ago, we should no longer be, we should be impatient with them now, because they have promised development in housing, and those promises have come to nothing. Just finally, I acted in a case at Ekurhuleni. They built RDP houses, right? Built RDP houses. But there was corruption in the allocation, which in fact is also characteristic of the entire RDP system. And the people who were promised that they would be the first to be accommodated in the RDP housing decided to occupy those houses. They broke the windows and they broke the doors, and they took over the houses. The government then went to court and tried to evict them. We then defended it on the basis that the allocation system was fraught and corrupt and there was nowhere else to go. And they had, in fact, made a promise that they would be the first. There's a judgment of the Supreme Court of Appeal saying you have no right to evict them. So even the judges have lost patience with the unfulfilled promises of development by the government. So theoretically, you are right that there is an apparent tension between land occupation and development. But in practice, that tension does not exist because the government lies about development. And in fact, more recent cases show that they admit that there's no budget for housing development. In fact, if you go to the Eastern Cape now, there are no housing developments. Even in Gauteng, there are no major housing developments. They say there's no money for them. In fact, the money that's available is going to other social programs, education and so. Even those programs, they're actually reducing them slowly, right? So where is development going to come from? Which is why I've argued in Land Matters that actually the criminalization, the de facto criminalization of land occupation should end. And we have to understand land occupation as part and parcel of development, which is a conversation the government refuses to have. You know? So it's like, okay, well, change the government. Let's remove the white people, let's put the black people. Oh, they behave like the same. So. I mean, your point about, you know, did we put too much faith in the Constitution? I think, anyway, you've put the point, it's a perfect point. I agree, I can't improve on it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, even though we have many more questions. So I think what we can do is to collect the questions online and look for a way for the advocate to engage with them. And for those who are here, we can continue the conversation when we walk out. Thank you so much, advocates, and for all your participation.
Brothers and sisters, we've been here for 2 hours, especially for the folks who are online. You know, it's a bit onerous and strenuous to be online for more than 2 hours. So we do need to close. I had wanted to ask you about the Hlophe perversion, you know, but we don't have time for that. We'll take it offline. How can someone who's impeached as a judge comes back and sit on the Judicial Service Commission? I mean, this is perverse, you know. And this is exactly the kind of outcome when you have parliamentary supremacy. It produces perverse outcomes. Without much ado, I want to call our own Joel Nechitenze, Khatu, to close for us. In fact, upon him, he has a lot to answer about the misdeeds of the government.
Thank you, Yama Chair of our council, for managing this event. I'm tempted to laugh. I do not know why, but I should just say I've got no answer to the question that was posed on land, but perhaps just to quote the Freedom Charter, the land shall be shared amongst those who work it, and perhaps that adds another layer as to whether when we talk about land reform, we're talking about an elite enterprise. We should also thank Professor Nganje for facilitating the discussion. In the earlier part of our session, there was lots of banter about the Chinese in terms of karate, or is this the Japanese? But in any case, what Professor Nganje succeeded in doing is to let 100 flowers bloom and 1,000 schools of thought to contend. We should also acknowledge the leadership of MISTRA, which is here and online, and our distinguished host, Professor Mpedi, and to express our appreciation that the partnership between MISTRA and UJ is growing from strength to strength. We should perhaps apologize, not so much to you gathered here, but particularly to those who joined virtually for starting a bit late. There are about 500 of them, I understand. And this includes my former boss in the ANC Department of Information and Publicity, Paulo Jordan, who kept on sending WhatsApps. What the H is wrong with you guys? And many other friends. It was beyond our control. If we were to weigh today's lecture on the scale of many indicators, I think we would say it's amongst the most significant. And there are three reasons for this as far as I'm concerned. First, the topicality in the context of the recent elections. I don't know whether I can say this now that I've noticed that the Deputy Minister of Justice is here. That many within the party political domain are casting about almost in a daze, trying to understand the full meaning of the outcome of the elections. And across society, many are wondering whether the current configurations in the GNU serve the people's interests. And I think there are many advocates who may be having buyer's remorse. The second reason why I think it's one of the most significant lectures is that we cast aside holy cows. And you have helped us understand the meaning of constitutionalism and how the Constitution can be delegitimized if there is a slow process of social change. People then are inclined to blame it for things that should be done right by those who are meant to implement the Constitution. The third reason is our choice of not only an irreverent topic, but also an irreverent speaker, because you raised everything, in my view, that needed to be raised on this issue. As you have taught us, representation and constitutionalism are not about abstract things. And a constitution should be located within the context of a country in which it claims both legality and legitimacy. But you have also taught us that human rights are universal in essence, and their realization and the realization of constitutional ideals is critically a product of the hard slog of social agency. And so, instead of celebrating those who stay away from elections, we should rather be asking ourselves the question, how do we ensure that they take part in the political and constitutional and economic processes so they help change South Africa for the better? You have left us the wiser, advocate, through your input. And I think another reason why this is one of the most significant lectures is the participation of the audience. And we should thank all of you because I should say some of you were as irreverent as the speaker himself. So we're thanking you here at the UJ's Ubuntu Chamber, as well as the colleagues who are on the virtual platform. Our gratitude to colleagues in MISTRA and UJ who helped organize this event. And this includes PR Agency 2807. Those in the chambers will now disperse for refreshments. I didn't panic when the lights went off because I believe in an engineer who says he's dealing with the challenge of load shedding. And we should acknowledge Yellowwoods for the sponsorship of some of the refreshments. So thank you to everyone. You'll be directed to the hall on the other side of the building. A very engaging event indeed.